I just wanted to ask one question before I've seen there are plenty of questions coming up in the chat, but I just wanted to ask one question from each of our panelists, really, which was the following. One of the things we are keen to try and do is make sure that the various principles in the curriculum aren't looked at in isolation, but that they are looked at, they are embedded holistically, both throughout the curriculum, but more broadly how schools are run. So an example of that would be the commitment to ensuring our young people understand about the climate emergency. So all new schools in Wales will now be net zero schools. But in the course of designing those schools, there are teaching opportunities for young people to understand why we are doing that. And we've just commissioned the construction of 2 primary schools, which will be built with natural fabrics and materials, and will be designed in conjunction with children in the school. So it's a kind of teaching tool about design and about the environment as well. So I was just interested to hear from each of the 3 panelists, whether there are any other similar things we should be looking at, either in relation to individual Robert Owen kind of priorities, if you like, or to cooperativism more generally. Dan's given us some in his contribution, but maybe I can ask you, Hazel, then Gillian, then Dan, to share any thoughts you have in that space. Hazel?
I think it relates to one of the questions that's come up in the chat as well, because of we have to do it holistically, whatever we do, but also we are guided by things like the national curriculum. And I think that is the piece where we can work and influence the trust so that these things are embedded, and that so you look at the curriculum as a whole, and it's things like having a broad and balanced curriculum, and that co-operative values and principles are embedded throughout. And you have to do that. You can't take them in isolation. So one of the things that the Co-op group did was develop the Co-op ways of being. And that's because as a retailer, you don't have very long to talk to colleagues about what makes us different from our competitors. So we needed a really quick way of being able to articulate co-operative values and principles, but it really translated well into education, and our academies use it throughout. But one of the things that we're really clear on that as well is you can't take the co-op ways of being in isolation either. So even though they are a summary of co-operative values and principles, essentially you have to use them together in tandem, because they don't work on their own. And I think this is it's the complexity of people and education and community. We do need to think about the bigger picture. We can't look at ourselves in isolation, and that's why cooperation is so important, and why we talk a lot about cooperation, collaboration, because actually as an individual, of course we can do well and do things, but we'll do much better if we work together. And I think that's the thing that you see coming through education, and it looks very different in each phase. So in primary and early years, it's just about children playing together and starting to look at that conflict resolution and skills that you develop of kind of how do you make friends, how do you recover when you break up. And I think that's the whole piece about education. It's about what's the culture and the ethos that you're creating. And I think that's something that's really powerful, because it is about looking at the community more broadly. You're not a school in isolation, you're actually part of a community, and you have assets and you have an impact on that community, whether children come to your school or not. So I think there's quite a lot within education that plays exactly to your point. But equally, I think it's why education has such an important role to play within the community. And if it's underpinned with co-operative values and principles, that's really beneficial as well.
Great, thank you, Hazel. Gillian, anything on the holistic imperative?
Yeah, it's all fascinating. And one of the things that they were always talking about when I worked at the Cooperative College was that there are 2 types of cooperative education. There is learning about cooperatives, and there is learning cooperatively. And it's being part of that. And you can't take people out of their community. You need to understand that they're part of the community, that schools are part of a community. And it's all fascinating stuff, but it's you can't do it in isolation. And the values and principles have to underpin everything that you do, whether you're actually learning about cooperation or not. It has to be there.
Absolutely, thank you. Hazel, there's a question. Your presentation's inspired a lot of interest, as we would expect, and there's a question about what plans a co-op group might have for working in other parts of the UK, for working in Wales and Scotland, for example?
So I think this is something that's around the devolved nations and the education system, and obviously in terms of the Co-op Academies Trust, it is England specific. So at the moment the growth is in England. In the future it will probably be influenced by what's currently happening, and then also what might happen in the future in terms of if we have a change in government, etc. So I can't really answer about the growth of the Co-op Academies Trust specifically, but I guess the point being that there has always been a desire for the Co-op Academies Trust to work with other schools and academies, and I think that principle will always remain because it's a part of who we are and what we want to do. So whether that's working with myself and understanding how the Co-op Group works with our Co-op Academies Trust, or looking at how the Co-op Academies Trust could work with other schools in terms of some of the work that they're doing, that's something that we're committed to and will look to do.
So if there's a school in Wales, for example, obviously not an academy, but if there's a school in Wales which was interested in embedding principles of cooperativism in its own curriculum design, that might be something you could have a conversation with, and have a conversation with them, and you would be open to that sort of working.
Definitely, and I think that there is some work that's happening within the trust that is looking specifically about how you embed cooperative values and principles, but it's something that takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. You have to kind of develop the concept and the framework and then look at how it then gets embedded. So absolutely the trust would be able to kind of have that conversation, but it's also something that the group can support as well in terms of how we've kind of supported the trust to do that over the years.
Great, thank you.
Jeremy, I'm back on the call now.
Okay, great. Okay.
I just wanted to add a couple of things with that, what you're saying about the schools. Just to kind of mention it really, the two schools that you said that were being built, you know, with sort of natural materials and lots of renewables, etc. That's brilliant. And just one thing just to suggest is that we look at opportunities to link up with co-ops, you know, like EGNI really, to kind of maximise funding going into those sorts of projects. So for example, if EGNI could be brought in to fund the solar panels, then that kind of, you know, reduces the build by whatever it might be, £100,000, and that money then could be spent on the kind of like cooperative curriculum development that Gillian was talking about, that those sorts of things. And I think the complication with the kind of approach that we tend to take is around procurement. Because obviously those schools will have been tendered out and there will be a principal contractor appointed to build them, etc. So we are talking to one major kind of construction company, but it's just trying to think of those sorts of opportunities, I guess, at an early stage with our capital build programme. We've worked extensively with Newport Council, who've been brilliant, and you know that really helped us then get work with other local authorities. But it's kind of just trying to, obviously, you know, the councils and government can't do everything, and it's really expensive if they try to, but to try and build those links in. The other thing, just to quickly flag up generally, is a brilliant charity called Energy Sparks, who've got a data platform for electric, gas, and solar generation in schools, and they've got it set up in a lot of schools in England and probably about 80 schools in Wales now, and it's really good. So the children can then sort of do campaigns like turning all their lights off, and they can see a real-time change in the energy half-hourly data within their schools. So we just want more local authorities to adopt that, and obviously we're really pleased that Welsh Government is funding a Welsh language version of the website as well, so that you know all schools will be able to participate in it. But it's really good because it's like they can see tangible differences in the data, rather than it being all very theoretical. And it just changes the control as well, because they can then talk to the head teacher or the energy managers and sort of say, look, we can see that our boilers are coming on at 3 o'clock in the morning. Why is that? Or you know, our whatever is 50 years old. can we look at changing it? And you know, obviously it's realizing then, of course, there are constraints on everyone within this, but at least then it's not just energy that's something that happens to us. The understanding of it can be held by young people themselves. So they're not, you know, on the streets protesting about things. They're actually able to be part of, you know, helping to make the decisions around it.
So an opportunity of getting in touch with them as they're developing their proposals, which are happening, the things that you were talking about there. So a specific talking about is those those designs are currently being worked on by authorities right across Wales who are interested in bidding for funding to design and build those 2 schools. So there's an opportunity for those kinds of conversations to happen, now at an early stage, if Dan is interested in doing that, I guess. But I was moving on to a question from the floor, as it were, to Gillian, which was about what aspect of Owen would be useful for us to remember today. And Gillian, would you speak in favour of an annual Robert Owen Day?
Most definitely. He is such an amazing person that he was involved in so many different things. I think using his ideas to set things going, which is what has happened over the last 2 centuries. The cooperative movement used his ideas, the trade union movement used his ideas, and he has so much to say, and so much to say today. All the, if you just think about the education stuff, all of the active education, the involving people in things, your example of the building of the new schools, Owen would have been right there. He would have been taking the young people to see what was being done, to see the plans being drawn up in the first place, and then taking them to see the building going on, and maybe even, doing a bit of the brick building, who knows. But he would have been involved in all of that involvement. One thing that the Cooperative College has been doing over the last sort of 20 years is developing learning resources. And they did some fantastic resources on Robert Owen, resources that could be used for schools to do activities around some of the subjects he was interested in. So that, the materials are there to work with. So yes, definitely.
Great. Well, I've got officials on the call who'll be interested to hear that, and Co-ops Mutuals Wales obviously have also been working on resources for Key Stage 2 and 3 in particular. So there's some interesting work that can be done there, I think. Hazel, a question from a colleague, which you touched on, but perhaps this is a sort of more direct version of it, which is, do you ever feel that the question says the capitalist focus of business curricula is in conflict with the co-op values and principles of the Academy Trust? How do you feel that those can be reconciled if you feel there's a tension?
I don't think there's necessarily a tension, because I guess realistically we are a cooperative movement operating within a capitalist system, and that's what we have had to do. And I think that there have obviously been times within the movement where the mention of profit has been problematic. We talk about surplus and the redistribution of surplus. So I think some of it is that we are within a capitalist system, and so therefore anything that we teach has to reflect that as well. And I think that the other thing is that the national curriculum would mean that they would be examined on the pieces that would need to be covered. So I think that some of it is about more broadly, and it comes to that point. I think that yes, it does come up in the kind of business curriculum, but actually I think the principles of cooperation and the kind of message of what we are looking to achieve in terms of creating a fairer world is much more than just the business curriculum. And I think that there are tensions in other parts of the curriculum as well, in terms of the reality, unfortunately, of the fact that listening today in terms of some of the things that were historically happening during the Industrial Revolution, we're going through the digital revolution now, and actually that tension still exists. You have got people that are generating incredible wealth and it's not being distributed fairly. So I think that some of the kind of principles of what we've always been kind of facing into as a movement still exist. It just looks different because it's 21st century versus back in the past. So I think that some of this is about empowering young people to understand where we've come from and why, the importance of cooperation, a movement that is international. It's not just the UK, it's not just the co-op food store, because if that's what a lot of children will think, because that's what they're familiar with. To understand then how they play a part of that as a student or a pupil that has an education that's embedded in Co-operative Values and Principles, and how that might be different, and then how they can then make the change they want to see, because they are empowered, they have a voice, and they are involved with the democracy of their academy. And then that goes on to become, citizens of the future who understand what their role is within society, both within their community as a kind of national role, and then internationally, because we are globally connected. And I think this is the thing, more than ever, through technology and industrialization, we are connected, and we can try and see ourselves in isolation. But again, it comes to the point we're not. We are connected, and we have a history and a shared history in terms of where we've come from and where we are. So I think there are tensions, and we can't ignore them because they exist. But what we have to do is to help young people to understand them so that they can actually tackle them and actually do something about them in the future, and make it so that we don't shy away from the difficult subjects.
Great. And actually the idea of, you were talking a bit about the agency of learners in that, weren't you, in your response? And I think that's a good way of reconciling quite a number of these tensions, really, because that's a kind of fundamental principle. We've probably got time for a couple more questions, I think. I'm going to ask Dan, perhaps in a moment, whether you will comment on Chris Bolton's question about the appointment of a new Future Generations Commissioner in Wales. Is there anything which can be done to amplify the connection between future generations and cooperativism? But I'm just going to respond to the point which Chris Hall has put in the chat, which is directed specifically at me. So there's a pilot in schools in Wales at the moment, working with 35 schools, where Wales TUC and some individuals have been working to create some resources and a training package for teachers, so they can, if they choose to.
I'll ask the question again, and hopefully Jeremy will be able to reply. Jeremy, we didn't catch your response. 35 schools being taught trade unionism as part of a pilot. Could we tweak it or develop it to bring in co-ops and Robert Owen? Back to Jeremy.
Thanks, Chris. Well, this is something which it's called the Unions in the World of Work pilot, which is part of the new curriculum, and it's been developed by Wales TUC and practitioners to make sure that schools and practitioners can, ensure young people are ethical, engaged citizens. Obviously, it's up to schools to decide whether they actually end up wanting to use these resources. But the great thing here is it's training teachers about how to deliver them as well. And I absolutely could see a way in which that could be extended or tweaked. So we can talk further about that, Chris. Very happy to do that. Okay, and I was going to hand over to Dan for any reflections on how we can amplify the connection between cooperative principles and the Future Generations Act, given that we have a new commissioner coming in shortly in Wales. Any thoughts on that, Dan?
Yeah, I think if those sorts of links just can be encouraged. The previous commissioner, I know, took a lot of interest in some of the energy co-ops across Wales, some of the wind turbine projects. And I think if that can be continued, and then I think to look at ways of introducing cooperatives in different forms within schools, whether it be through ownership of shares, co-op shares of nearby wind farms or distant wind farms, really, or other co-ops taking place there. I'm actually there's a conference in a few weeks' time in Cardiff, organised by Compass and the European Co-op Congress, and it's called Young People and Cooperation. So perhaps that obviously would be a good forum to sort of think about that, and so I'll kind of try and raise that point there and perhaps feedback. I think that just also to flag it up, it's on the Compass website, and it's obviously dealing with these sorts of issues very pertinent to Wales, looking at young people and education and cooperation. So I do encourage people. I think it's the 21st and 22nd of November, and one of the organisations that's speaking is ResCoop, who are the European Federation for Energy Co-ops, who are a brilliant organisation. And we're quite pleased because some children from Llanmartin Primary are coming, and they've got solar panels, and they've been doing loads more to reduce their carbon footprint. So they're coming along to explain how they're members of a co-op and are kind of doing stuff themselves to take action on climate change.
Dan, thanks for that. I think we've probably covered most of the questions in the chat. There's just one thing I want to draw attention to before we maybe draw to a close, which is there was a comment in the chat which were around practical suggestions and practical guidance on how on how young people can get involved in cooperatives directly as part of their education. And I was also saying that in my area, schools are connecting with the local credit union and running school-based saving arrangements, which reflect the co-op principles, but also working, setting up and running co-op cafes. So there are good examples, I think, in our education system of this happening, but there's also obviously a lot to learn from overseas as well. And I just wanted to thank Gillian, Hazel and Dan for a really interesting discussion, which has navigated both questions of principle, but also really practical things about what we can do to take forward Robert Owen principles in the work of our education system generally. So thank you to the three of them for that, and thank you to the organisers for the opportunity I've had to participate in the discussion as well.
And thank you for everyone for participating in that helpful and generous way. We hope you'll join us for a future event, perhaps when it's held on an annual Robert Owen Day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.